Let's meet our guest. She is a union organizer, scholar, and writer, strikes correspondent for The Nation, the author of No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age, and last year's A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. Jane McAlevey.
Hey, really nice to be here.
It's so great to have you. So much of the conversation right now, in the wake of, Bernie not becoming president of the United States of America, is about what other levers are at our disposal outside of the electoral realm to try to get something in terms of policies and protections that meet the moment that we're in. We're still very much in a health crisis and an economic crisis in a country that was already so many people were struggling, and it was just exacerbated by COVID. And unions and organizing are really at the center of that conversation. And yet, because of historically low union density and so many, especially young people who have never participated in one and might not even have a family member who've participated in one, there's, I think, a lot of kind of cultural ignorance about this. So I want to start by asking you, why are unions so important? And in particular, why is the power to strike and withhold labor so important?
Oh, some of my favorite questions. How long do we have? No, I'm kidding. So, okay, that's good. Let me just start with the political economic structure that we exist in called capitalism. I think it's so fundamental that when people think about, like, if we want to analyze the power structure analysis, which is if you're a good organizer, you wake up in the morning obsessing about two things. One, what's the power structure analysis of any fight you're in? And then two, how you're going to win and build solidarity to do that. So if we start with the meta picture about why unions matter, like warts and all, by the way, and I have no idea if anyone here has seen the opening line of my new book, but the opening sentence of A Collective Bargain is, unions are such a pain in the ass, right? That's literally the opening of my third book, just to get it out there. So warts and all, as I say, complicated as the structures are, when we are existing in a power structure called capitalism, and they might want to call it democratic capitalism, but boy, that's a small d on a good day right now. Mm-hmm. But in a structure called capitalism, where most decision-making, big decisions, are made either by huge corporations or outside of the sort of formal policy arena as it exists, like how much policy is made by corporations in real estate and zoning laws, or there's all these other mechanisms that corporations have to maintain power that have nothing to do with a vote somewhere, right? So in a system called capitalism, we have two theoretical power structures. One is people voting in elections. We know there's a whole lot of limitations to that, and I'm sure we'll come back to it at some point. The second, though, and the one that the capitalist class and the political elite fear the most, is a united working class that has the power to either shut down production or seriously hamper production. And they're different a little bit because of the differences between sort of the heyday of the manufacturing economy, where like shutting down the factory was easier in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, than my life as primarily a healthcare worker organizer. We don't shut down a hospital because you kill people. But but if we have 100% out strike and 100% of every hospital worker walks out of the hospital, and you force the employer to pay for an entire second layer of staff, often at a very, very high cost to them, that's what scabs cost, a lot of money. So in the case of something like healthcare, it's seriously hampering the production system. And ain't no one putting up with scabs in a healthcare setting for long because you're going to kill a patient, just for the record. So it's either workers' ability to withdraw their labor, to force concessions from their employer, and then if we can scale up our strikes, to force concessions from the employer class, or it's seriously disrupting the production process in the service economy, as in the case of a healthcare setting. It's seriously disrupting the production process enough that it's going to cost the boss a whole lot of money, and they're going to make a decision to actually make some concessions. So to me, at the foundational level, if you exist inside of a system called capitalism, then one of the two, if not the most powerful lever that's available to ordinary working people, is our ability to withdraw our labor and stop the bosses from making the money, because we make the money, frankly, right? They cash in on it, but workers make the money.
So the next question is, what are the structural impediments to us having more strikes at a moment like this, where people are desperate to figure out ways to get our kind of two-party duopoly to pay attention? I understand, obviously, a part of it is that labor protections have been stripped away over the past few decades. Obviously, like we mentioned, union density is low. I want to know, what are the obstacles to getting to supporting strike efforts, and what can people who even don't belong to unions do, if anything, to offer support?
Really good questions. Related and different. So, I would say the question of why we don't have as many strikes as we used to is complicated. I'm trying to unpack it fairly quickly. So you started with labor protections have been weakened, for sure. After Ronald Reagan, in 1981, exercised or used a weapon. Most people don't understand this. The weapon that Reagan used when he fired 12,000 striking air traffic control workers in 1981, and I outlined this in a collective bargain because most people don't know this. From 1937 on, okay, let me back up. 1935, we passed the National Labor Relations Act, right? That's what codifies, legalizes collective bargaining. FDR, the New Deal. Okay, so it's 1935. They passed the National Labor Relations Act. We know there were some limitations to it, namely cutting out most of the black workers in the South. Okay, that's not a little limitation. It was a big one. But still, it was pretty radical law. Let's come back to the nature of compromise later. However, right away, the big business elite challenged it, and they took multiple rounds of it to the Supreme Court, hoping that one of the, how the business right is super strategic, like 7 or 8 different lawsuits immediately went to the court system, like in every district court across the country, to try and stop the implementation of the NLRA, of the National Labor Relations Act. By 1937, the U.S. Supreme Court, in 2 schizophrenic rulings, which is so still common today, like that they can do one thing and another thing all at once. On the one hand, they codify the law. So the National Labor Relations Act survives a huge legal challenge by the big corporate business elite, the equivalent of the Amazons of that era, right? Big steel, big coal, et cetera. The Supreme Court sustains the overall National Labor Relations Act, but it also says, in sustaining the law, that employers have the right to replace workers if they walk off the job and go on strike. Now, that was part of the same 1937 docket of lawsuits that were challenging a worker's right to form a union. What's fascinating about it, and again, I talk about this in the new book, what's fascinating about it is most people, even in my circles, don't realize that it had been legal to replace striking workers since 1937. What's fascinating to me about power is that it took until 1981 for anyone to try it. And that's what Reagan did. And I think it's because the power structure had shifted so substantially that he was taking a gamble, like, I'm going to try this lever that we've never tried yet. And the cultural conditions had become so hostile at that point, and unions had become so weak, partly by internal faux pas, you know what I mean? Because we stopped organizing, that it was 81 when Reagan actually pulls the trigger that existed from 1937 on. And in a collective bargain, I argue it's because the power of the working class movement, power of the civil rights movement, which is part of working class, right, both, but like the power of our social and economic movements for about 50 years kept employers from daring to do what Reagan did from the White House. So when Reagan did that, he essentially created open season for good on the working class by replacing all of those workers. And that meant union leaders freaked out, and every union leader that was already strike averse had a perfect excuse in their mind for, it's too dangerous to strike, except a lot of us keep running strikes. So obviously it wasn't too dangerous, right? So that's the part B of it. But I think few people understand that the 1981, what's called PATCO, right, which is when Reagan literally replaces and destroys the lives of 12,000 workers who had strategic power. Like the air traffic controllers thought, well, they can't replace us, like we control the airspace.
Right.
And then he literally brought in the military and took every single person and said, you're going to staff, right, our military operators are going to staff the air traffic controllers. And suddenly Workers who saw themselves as strategically important were fired, replaced, their union destroyed. And from then on, it gave national union leadership the excuse to say strikes are too dangerous, when in fact the message should be, what do we need to do differently to prepare differently to have a strike?
I know this is a big question, but I'm curious, what happened in the 1970s, the last, era of widespread labor militancy that culminated in the PATCO loss? Should we say that PATCO was just simply the will of a particularly anti-labor reactionary president, or is there a greater trend there?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a greater trend. So, so we have 35, the high water mark in terms of passing the law. Again, with some issues, but high water mark is 35. And in a collective bargain, I sort of outline there are these 12 years where most of the success of the trade union movement happens, which is 35 to 47. What happens in 1947? The passage of horrible amendments to the National Relations Act, which are called the Taft-Hartley Amendments. So in 1947, and again, part of what I point out in the book that I think, again, is not commonly understood is that was primarily motivated by a bunch of racists in the South who understood that the radical trade unions, there were many of them back then, that the radical trade unions were forcibly integrating the plants all over the South and challenging Jim Crow. So that's a setup for Taft-Hartley. So Taft-Hartley rolls back sympathy strikes, solidarity strikes, creates a legal structure called right to work laws. So there's like 12 huge attacks that come out of the Taft-Hartley amendments that begin to just gut the power of an organized working class. That goes on, but the power sustains itself, right? There's like a legacy power already from 12 years of fighting and striking. People hold on to their contracts. And then the second big wave of the attack, I say, begins in the 60s with the formulation of professionalized union busting law firms, whose specialty is, frankly, terror. I mean, literally terrorizing workers who are trying to form unions. We saw that in Bessemer. You see it everywhere. I mean, quite frankly, there's no difference in what happened in Bessemer than what happens in any A-level, what we call employer boss fight, employer campaign. So they start to weaponize professionals who walk in, fire you, campaign against the workers, hold captive audience meetings. If you've never gone through one, because I've been through plenty, I can tell you they are terrifying. So if you haven't done the organizing work right ahead of time, you ain't going to survive that kind of attack by your employer. So that's wave two. That starts in the mid-60s. And then, quote unquote, globalization. This term that I just call the destruction of unions. I don't even know why we call it globalization. It makes me batshit crazy. Globalization has no purpose. None. There is no, if you really analyze what we think of as globalization, there is literally no purpose to it except allowing corporations to go to a different country where there's slave labor or very cheap labor and workers with no rights and recreate the products that were once created in not just the US, right? But also in, let's say, countries in Europe where there were stronger, even stronger, quote unquote, labor protections, right? The same game is happening, by the way, in Germany right now. Why do we got German auto plants in the US South? Because they're also escaping strong labor protections. So globalization and union busting set up the context that we got hit with in 1981, which was, Reagan saying and being coached by a bunch of business elite to pull the, quote unquote, like pull that trigger. Like, let's try to do that thing called replacing all the workers and let's see if we get away with it. And get away with it they did. And a divided, an already weak trade union movement that had turned from the terminology is from organizing unions to business unions, right? Like unions became this kind of business. And that set in like the McCarthyism. Okay, McCarthyism is a very big moment. Taft-Hartley, McCarthyism drives the left out of the trade union movement in the United States. And I mean, really drives the left out. So the people who built the trade unions in the 1930s and 40s are jailed, expelled, thrown out. 10,000 people get expelled in the course of like several months, right? That's all the actually good organizers in the trade union movement under McCarthyism. Then that sets up business unionism, where people act like the union is like I just hung up a phone call with a group of educators, I won't name the state, where people were saying the way people still talk about a union in our state is that a union is an insurance card for when you get in trouble. I got to tell you, if that's the language that you use about a union, you're dead on arrival, right? Because a union ain't a damn insurance card. A union is when a majority of workers, and I would argue a supermajority of workers, form an organization strong enough and build unbreakable solidarity and bonds that they can then begin to force their employer to do that which they want and stop their bad employer from doing that which they don't want. Like, that's the definition of a union I was trained on, and I'm sticking to it. It's about what workers have the power to do.
Jane, that's such a compelling story, and it's such a sympathetic narrative. I find it difficult to understand why the Democratic Party, which used to rely disproportionately on support from labor to survive. I mean, I understand historically there was this, moment where the Democrats decided to compete with big money Republicans, that they were going to basically throw labor under the bus and do exactly what Republicans were doing, and corporate money that was at odds with the interest of labor. But when you're standing in a moment like this, where we just came out of Trump and everyone's like, God, we got to do whatever we got to do to beat Trump, and we got to do whatever we got to do to defeat global fascism, and who knows what's around the corner, and all hands on deck, and, all of these voter ID laws and all of these other ways to exclude populations that are historically Democratic voters. I mean, we're really got our backs up against the wall. Why don't we have more Democratic leadership? And I know Joe Biden offered some words of support for Bessemer, kind of, and that was really lauded by the media. But why am I not hearing Joe Biden or other Democrats in leadership on television telling the narrative of how there was this assertive effort to undermine the organizations that provided the most protection for the American worker, and which got more equality for the American working class than perhaps any other movement in American history, and walk through that history that you just outlined in a way that is just so compelling that it would, to the extent that Biden's a couple of words made people feel good in Bessemer, could inspire an entire nation to change the cultural story that they have in their head about what a union is, that Reagan really put into place. Why don't we have that kind of pushback at the top tier?
I mean, I think, one, I really wish that Joe Biden would do more of what you just articulated, by the way. I keep having this fantasy. I definitely had it. That's why I had Bernie won. I was all excited about talking to you one day about let's set up the fireside chat. What's the equivalent of what he's going to do every Sunday night to educate the American working, whatever. Okay. Anyway, but so, different
a dream
film.
Deferred.
Yeah. Back to now. Dream deferred for the moment, but it doesn't mean that Biden couldn't be doing it, first of all. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it doesn't mean that other folks couldn't be doing it. I think some are trying. But I think at this point, I call in a collective bargain, I just say, there's the party of inequality, essentially. And that's the top tier of the Democrats and the Republicans. And they are functioning more like a single party and representing singularly the interests of Wall Street and or Silicon Valley at this point. So, I mean, I think it'd be great if there was way more of national explanations of what happened. Just walk through those 4 phases of the destruction of an organized working class. I call it, by the way, sort of playing on E.P. Thompson, when I frame out what happened from 1970 on, to Virgil's point too, I call it the unmaking of the working class. They set out in the early 1970s to unmake a united working class, and they've done a pretty damn good job at it. That's one. So 2, I think that the relationship between national unions tends to be way too close to the top leadership of the Democratic Party. And we saw this really strongly, by the way, in the Obama administration. When people were basically told, I would hear stories from people about what Valerie Jarrett would say to them, if you crossed him early on, right? The message was, it's people confusing access and power. Let's start there. There's a huge confusion between access to the White House and access to people and power. So in the first year of the Obama administration, there were a ton of folks, I'll not name anyone, who were in there trying to actually force a more aggressive agenda on a set of issues. And we're essentially threatened, and I mean really threatened, you cross us once. This was the message from the White House in 2009, functionally. You cross us once, You are never, ever, ever being invited to the White House ever again. And not only that, but it may get worse. Like we're going to tell people we're not coming in a room with you. Like that's how serious the power game is being played behind closed doors. And if you look at, it's like Marshall Gans wrote former organizing director at the Farm Workers with Cesar Chavez. He wrote a piece in 2009, like October 2009. He waited patiently about 9 months or something. Now, he wasn't leading an organization, but he was here on the same stories. And he wrote an opinion piece in the Los Angeles Times that was brilliant, by the way. It's worth looking at. And basically said, we didn't put you in power to do this. We put you in power because you promised change, right? And change is the kind of change that we demanded, all of us who worked on your campaign. We're not seeing that change right now. But that was what, and he got shunned for writing that opinion piece.
And no one backed him up? Because it feels like, again and again, it's this collective action problem. Of course there's going to be blowback. Of course you're always up against a powerful foe. That's the whole point. That's why we were trying to organize. That's why we're trying to be a collective force.
Yeah.
But the problem is when people are left out high and dry. I mean, even in the Reagan example, there's a world where instead of turning tail, union leadership comes together and says, absolutely not, because there's not enough people in the military or military expertise to fill every job in every sector in America. I don't know if there are enough military nurses and doctors to fill in every hospital in America. I don't know if there's enough people who can drive every bus in America, and on and on and on.
Yeah. There isn't. But then it would depend on union leadership investing in getting the troops ready to take the kind of action that it's gonna take for us to pass any number of important policy changes. I keep trying to think of 2021 as 1933, right? Mm. So if we're 33, I keep going back to what was going on in 1933, what was going on in 1934. So what's got to happen in 2021? What's got to happen in 2022? If we're sort of making the analogies to, we've got a president who's willing to, and he is. I mean, look, the one thing I'll concede is Biden has definitely said the word union more than any national politician in my lifetime. And it's great. On the other hand, we know it ain't enough, but it is great. But
yeah, it feels like your point about access. It's like you get a lot of, I see you, I hear you, I'm a union man. And then what?
Yeah. Yeah. And the what has to be throwing down for things that change the power structure, right? Part of what we have to do, the PRO Act, first of all, what's interesting is even inside of the PRO Act, which we do desperately need, by the way, and it would change the structural balance of power. Like if more workers could form unions and more workers could strike without being threatened with being replaced, that's a structural advantage in our favor. On the other hand, it might be important to note that they pulled out of the PRO Act card check, which is actually the thing that most of the progressive unionists wanted the most, right? Which is that when a majority of workers sign an authorization card saying, yeah, we want to be a union member, the employer has to recognize that. So that was taken out of the PRO Act, by the way.
By whom?
I don't even know, because I'm not invited to those circles anymore. That might surprise you since I've written 3 books. I used to be, by the way, sister, in the circles that were in those rooms making those decisions. But after Raising Expectation and Raising Hell, the first book, which actually you didn't mention, which is the one that made it so, where I actually I called out the history of people, selling out the workers from the top of the couple of unions, that did not endear me. So I'm not in those circles. I can imagine
but generally speaking,
because I was in them. Yeah.
This isn't like Republicans. The point I just want to make is that so often when bad things like this happen, it's, this is a Republican thing. But my understanding from a recent interview we did with David Dayen is that these big bills are being drafted basically by Nancy Pelosi, not in committee, and that a lot of the things that are happening are coming straight from Democratic leadership and aren't even the result of these kind of negotiations across party lines. It's Democrats negotiating with themselves, and that they're responsible for the weakening of these policies of, lowering the corporate tax rate, of, lowering the $2,000 checks and all of this stuff that I think in the broader media sphere, it gets kind of translated as, we got to compromise with Republicans.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of game over, right? We're not going to when you're bargaining against yourself, you're not getting anywhere, which is something I have to teach workers all the time when we're actually in negotiations, right? We're not going to start off by bargaining against ourselves. We got to build the power to bargain against the boss. So I think let's stick on the access versus power thing for a minute, or the confusion of access and power, because I think it's actually very deep. And one thing is the two movements that didn't play access equals power were the only two movements that succeeded under Obama, right? Starting with the immigration work and then the Dreamers work. So the two social movements that built power and challenged, like said, okay, well, you're not going to invite us to the White House. We don't give a shit. We're going out on the streets. Like the two movements that did that, which was the immigrant rights movement and gay and lesbian movement, right, around marriage equality. Like those were the two movements that said, we're not going to accept your polite pact. We're actually going to go fight like hell. And those are the two movements that actually won something serious in the Obama years. So in the labor movement, they drop what was then the Employee Free Choice Act. That's sort of the equivalent of the PRO Act, but they're a little bit different, right? But this one is weaker, and I'm sure whoever signed off on it, no one that we know. But they dropped some key provisions, but the Employee Free Choice Act, which was the equivalent back then, the demand that the House of Labor was making on the Obama administration, gets dropped like a hot potato, just gone, right? That thing is like dropped after the ACA fight, never again to hear a word about it. So like Labor went all out to elect, a majority in the Senate, a majority in the House, and take the White House, and got what for it? I'm still pausing on that question. But anyway, while we think about, let's say what we didn't get structural change in labor law reform. We haven't gotten it since Johnson first tried. We didn't get it under Carter. We didn't get it under Clinton. We didn't get it under Obama. So why people think we're going to get it right now, I'm a little confused by. I'm just saying, but that's why I'm sticking with the organizing work. Because we don't, on the one hand, it would make it better for us to pass that law, and desperately better. On the other hand, dealing with the power structure we have today, we know that there have been a bunch of supermajority strikes lately where they have won. So it's this weird thing about like, well, let's not wait for the fantasy of changing that law to go out and actually start forcing some changes by having strikes at a more state, local, and regional level. But in terms of the access equals power stuff, it's really deep. And I mean, I think the very first story that I ever wrote, I have to tell you, I don't even think of myself as a writer, like at all. Like I'm an organizer, and occasionally I write, and I write when I think it's useful to write something that should be debated and discussed. So that's basically what my 3 books are, is like trying to foment some discussion and trying to teach people what building power really means and what it looks like. That's what organizers do in every fight we're in. So it's like, when I step into the writing role, it's like when I'm trying to just do that with a larger population. So my first article ever was in The Nation magazine. Okay, second article, but really my first article I ever really wrote in The Nation magazine was December of 2010. We've just seen trifecta red take over the country, right? The midterm elections in 2010. And I'm like ballistic rip. I'm like freaking out about what just happened at the state and local level all over the United States. And that's where I first say, access doesn't equal power. So the nice game that you played for the last 2 years of like not challenging that we haven't made any advances on labor law reform didn't get us anything. And not only did it not get us anything, what we got was the end of 2014, we got some executive orders and some National Labor Relations Board rulemaking that actually did help a bunch of workers form unions in the last year of the Obama administration. And then those rules were immediately undone because they weren't laws, right? They were just internal rulemaking. So I think it's that I really believe, I have come to experience, I should say, that when and I mean in this case, like workers, when our national leadership structures have less faith in workers and more faith in what the leadership, the Democratic Party, is going to do, like for us or for them, we're in a lot of trouble. So we have to reorient. Like all 3 of my books are like reorienting to what is possible when we have faith in the intelligence of ordinary workers in the working class. Because I got to tell you something, I do. Because I've been in campaigns with tens of thousands of workers and understand that when we lay out the power analysis and explain what it's going to take for them to beat their boss badly and win a lot, they actually know how to do it, right? But it's like, in the absence of knowing how to do that, well, how will workers know how to do it? So it's like this catch-22. Yeah. So, I have been on this, like whatever they say, a dog on a bone or something, and doing my level best to try and teach workers by the tens of thousands what it takes to form the kind of union that is going to be capable of making not just a small win, but transformational change. We need a lot of it, and we need it now. And I think there is a fervent of people right now at the sort of base in a lot of unions who are pushing back hard and who are building and who are leading local strikes. I mean, that Chicago strike, the LA strike, I could go through a bunch of them, but like the Marriott strike, there's been a lot of really good strikes in the last couple of years. We need way more of them. We need them fast. But you don't just wake up and call a strike. You don't. It doesn't work that way. You actually have to do a lot of work to build towards a supermajority strike. So we need them, and we need to teach people how to do them.
So I want to stay on that point for a second because, you know, a lot of folks have, and I think a despairing moment on the left, I think rightly looked to organized labor as one of the few levers of power that remain, but have perhaps prematurely been like, we need a general strike, et cetera. And I hear organizers say, that's premature. You can't just manifest that for all the reasons. And what I think I'd like to know more about is what, and I know this isn't the point of organizing, but for our audience, and because of COVID and because everyone's so dispersed and because so many people aren't in unions, I'd like to know if there's more that can be done to support those kind of efforts. You know, should we be giving to strike funds instead of perhaps, you know, a middling Democratic candidate? You know, should we be spending our time in different ways that are shifting from this electoral context potentially to a labor context? And to what extent is there a possibility that some of these spontaneous moments like the George Floyd protest, where people are motivated to fill the streets because the moment just demands it, to what extent is it useful to try to leverage that energy into some of these labor actions as well?
So mobilization, like what we saw coming out of the horrific murder of George Floyd on camera. We need a lot of mobilization. Like, we need a lot of good mobilization, for sure. And sometimes it just happens, like when you watch murder in slow motion. But to withdraw your labor from an employer, where what you might get is fired tomorrow, and you're already in economic straits, is actually a very different equation. Like, the decision to go out in a pandemic, which all of us did, right, in reaction to George Floyd, put on our masks, screw the rules, let's go out and do it. That was one set of risk, and the outrage overweighed the risk. And, you know, people did it in very large numbers. And that was a great thing. And it's created a lot of good energy. Right now, it's created accountability, not even justice. It's created accountability for one murderous cop who's, you know, hopefully going to go off to jail for a long time. But in terms of what we have gained so far, there's like energy and mobilization, which is powerful. But we have to try and figure out what are we actually getting too. Right. Like what's, again, back to the power analysis. So that's mobilization, and that's really powerful, and it matters. What I write about in No Shortcuts in the second book, what I try and really outline is the difference between mobilizing and organizing. So mobilizing is when we all come together because we're pissed off about something. And we protest and we get pissed off. And that's very important. It's going to change. It's going to do a couple things. It's going to change the narrative, right? We hear a lot. In fact, I'm sick of hearing about changing the narrative, but I'll stick on it for a minute because changing the narrative ain't getting us to the Holy Land, right? It's a piece of our work. Sure. So the narrative is changing right now around what is and is not acceptable to do to a human being in this country. And that is a damn good thing that the narrative is shifting and that people's outrage is rising. But if you want to translate that to something like how do we get to a general strike, it's not a direct line equivalent because though some people took risk with their lives, right? We know the cops are going to club the crap out of you and shoot some people and whatever. So there is certainly risk in mobilization for sure. Having had a night sick chokehold several times against myself, thinking I was going to die, and I'm a white girl. So like, you know, it clearly happens to a lot of people out there. But what I would say is, what it takes to build supermajority unity by which workers in large numbers will withdraw their labor and walk off the job under threat of being fired when the only way they're putting food on the table is that shitty job they have. That requires what I call organizing. And that means a whole lot of conversations. And I want to put one parenthesis right here. Organizing does not take a long time. Just want to say that and come back to it. Because part of what freaks me out is whenever I talk about organizing, People are like, oh, it'll take us 10 years to do all that. You know what I mean? No, actually, it doesn't. It actually doesn't. Like when you know the method, there are methods and skills. And when we apply the methods and the skills, you can go from a very weak level of worker engagement and participation to a supermajority strike, like in a year or even less, in 6 months or in 2 years, depending on the scale of the fight that you're about to take on. So one, we need way more organizing. Like the fact that the Republican Party got, Jesus Christ, how many votes in the end? They keep debating them. 72, 74 million, whatever he who will not be named got. It was way too effing many, right? Like way too many. The fact that there's that much confusion in the voting population, that 70-something million people would pull the lever for someone who literally was hoping to kill most of them, is like, means we got a lot of work to do out there. And if we do that work well, it actually can happen fast. So what can people who are not in a union ought to be trying to figure out really hard how to build one. Like if you're a worker who's eligible to form a union, geez Louise, try and figure it out. You can go to any number of places to do that. I'm endlessly running schools right now with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung out of Germany. They're online. The next one starts May 18th. They're free. People can sign up and are signing up by the thousands. Like, get the fundamentals, learn them, and start practicing. That's one. You go to labor notes. You go to, well, actually, there aren't a lot of places to go. That's part of the problem. But there's a handful of places that you can go to try and get the basics of, like, what does it take to form a union? So if you don't have one, start trying to figure out how to form them. What a lot of people are doing is taking one of my books, I don't care, photocopy it. I really don't give a crap. You know, put it on the web and photocopy it, whatever, like read it and book group it. I mean, I am shocked every day when people email me and share guides with me about study groups that they're doing on various books. That's how the Virginia education strike happened, right? Like people just, it comes out of Bernie, people having their expectations raised, had the Bernie campaign in 2016. And then they're like, how do we actually do this, right? Next thing we know, we had a 34,000 worker strike, right? In West Virginia, that was illegal. Beautiful. But they didn't go just from, they believed in Bernie to the strike. They actually had a whole series of study groups that were going on where they were studying and building and understanding how would they know that they were ready. That's what this thing called structure tests are. Like, how do you know you're ready? When I am teaching workers what it takes to form a union, there's a lot of really, I think everyone can do it, but there's actually skill and method involved in it. And so one is try and find a place where you can get skill and method. And we are doing free classes sort of endlessly right now. And we've already put 17,000 people through them in less than 1 year under COVID, right? From all over the world, because all over the world, our standards are being crashed by a global political elite that looks like the marriage of, you know, Pelosi with whoever, you know, the political elite that are more aligned than they are with the working class. So it's learn how to do it. And people, you know, I did a little ditty video a couple of years ago, like during the Marriott strike, when I realized there were so many people around me who had no idea how to do strike support. Like, no idea. I was like, y'all need to get down to that picket line in Oakland, California right now where those Marriott workers are. You need to bring them food. You need to go clap. You need to call the media. Like, I went through this whole list of like 10 things that ordinary people can do to support a strike, because I realized that, like, we're so far from so many strikes that most people don't even know how to effing do that. Yeah. So one is like strike support. Like, what does that mean? It doesn't mean you go down there. It means you call up every single damn person you know. You organize some food. You get down there with 35 people. You stand on the line. You talk to the workers. You got 50 more people to come back to that line, and you hold that line and help them hold that line, right? So, like, there's strike support and there's forming new unions. And we need to do a massive amount of both of those things. Anyone can do it. Does take some method, does take some skill, does take some practice.
I want to talk more about that, and I want to bring you back because we could talk about kind of those strategic particulars of, you know, kind of organizing one-on-one, and we absolutely should. And I've watched you have those conversations on some other lefty podcasts and really learned a lot from them. But because of the relatively limited time we have remaining, I want to kind of unpack some tension that has emerged on the left around this question of organizing, because how it's framed right now is that there are a pool of people who like and respect and understand the gravity and importance of organizing, and there are a group of people who kind of want a quick fix. What I perceive is that there is one group where everyone understands and values the promise of organizing, but there are these political moments that emerge that aren't necessarily contingent on organizing, or if they are, there is potentially a gap between union leadership and rank and file, like we saw with the culinary union workers in Bernie and Nevada. And the kind of idea of organizing is floated as, oh, well, you're not an organizer, or the organizers don't want this, as a way to cut off discussion of an idea or political strategy at the pass. And I really would love it if we could have a conversation about some of these political strategies without the implication being that organizing isn't a both and aspect of it. And so to that end, I want to ask you about, I mean, I know everyone kind of like loses their minds, but about this moment of force the vote, where the argument against it was, well, if the vote for Medicare for All isn't going to go anywhere, besides which union leaders, organizers aren't behind it, as compared to this moment with the PRO Act, both of which, by the way, I support and entirely for, even though the PRO Act similarly has significant obstacles because of the filibuster and the fact that it would require 10 Republicans to vote for it to pass. Now, I feel like I'm very ideologically consistent here. Let's try for Medicare for All and all the other asks that were actually gettable under force the vote, getting rid of Richie Neal as the head of Ways and Means Committee, getting rid of PAYGO, et cetera. And let's shoot for the PRO Act, because then again, we at least get this kind of narrative conversation going around, which I know is not enough to your point, but is something and to help to pushing the Overton window and raises people's consciousness and their expectations. But the framing is so different in those two instances. I just find it to be confusing that in one instance, it seemed like there was, the fact of union disinterest was dispositive to some as to why it wasn't a good idea. And in the PRO Act context, there is a lot of union interest, but the fact of it being, likely to pass doesn't seem that different. But that's the excuse for why there's a different treatment in each instance. Can you help me understand this? Because I'm a little confused.
Yeah, I can try with one caveat, which is which could be frustrating for you, but like the caveat is, I decidedly was. I mean, I was in a shitstorm of work with teachers unions trying to survive the school open and closing. So I did not get deep in the weeds in that debate. I was actually fighting in the trenches trying to figure out how to not get people killed.
Understandable.
I mean, I don't mean that as more or less important. I just mean that's just really
no. I certainly don't understand it. I expect anyone to have been quite online as I was at that time.
but so here's what for me, and I appreciate the discussion. So here's what I think we need to be open to discussion, by the way, as a general rule, right? About strategy and tactics and power and blah, blah, blah. So the first thing I think is two quick things that relate to this topic. When I'm teaching workers how to build the power to win, I talk about essentially governing power. Like if you win your election narrowly, and if you only have 55% united going up against the employer in your contract campaign, you are not going to come out of it with the kind of contract that you want. Mm-hmm. Because you basically have enough power to even get to the table. Versus, so I'm just relating that to governing power. I think one thing that's beautiful about unions, despite all the complexities, is because of the structure of when workers vote to form a union, they have to then fight again, all over again, to win their first contract. For those of us who are trying to really win big stuff and teach workers to win really big stuff, like national healthcare system, for sake of argument, it gives us an opportunity to explain the difference between a narrow victory and governing power. And that's what getting to 95% unity and ready to strike is going to get you, in my own negotiations experience, when we've won, for sake of argument, on the path to getting to Medicare for All, when we've had the power to win 100% fully employer-paid healthcare coverage for you and your family and all your dependents. That's a high watermark in a contract. That's what everyone in America should have. Everyone in America should have what I just said. It's just that it should be a, Medicare for All, single payer system, whatever we're going to call it. But to win that in a union contract fight is hella hard. And it's going to require you to be strike ready. So there's lessons there to me about governing power. So do we have the power to govern? And there's two concepts here. One is we have paper thin. We barely have a majority in either of those damn houses right now, right? We are at paper thin. barely majorities, and a majority of what? A majority of Joe Manchins, and what's your lunatic name from Arizona? Like,
Cinema,
I'm not even call it like that. Yeah, there's just how much I pay attention to. Like, I'm not even like, that's not even, we don't even have a majority, right? We've got a couple of wingnuts and really problematic people who are dressed up as Democrats. I mean, there's a lot more, but the particular ones we're discussing. So one concept is like, how do we get to governing power and what do we do with it? And the second thing I want to say, still on this topic, is the left has held power so infrequently that I'm not sure we're very good at it when we get the chance to even
I agree with that.
Right?
I agree with that.
And it really does go back to it. So here's what's weird. So back in the day when I was National Deputy Director of the Healthcare Division of the second largest, well, officially the biggest union, since the National Education Association isn't in the AFL, but like when I was the National Deputy Director for organizing for the country's biggest union, before I out loud challenged some of the decisions that were being made, that was the closest. I was involved in enough high-level work. We had enough power in some parts of the union and key states and key regions, like the union that I led, for example. Like, we had enough power that we were actually in governing conversations. Like, there was nothing the legislature would do without first calling us and making sure that they weren't going to get their ass kicked if they did it, right? So there's so few of us who have even been in that experience before that I think it's hard to realize how challenging those moments are and how challenging governing actually is.
That is exactly the reason why it was frustrating for some people on the left that there wasn't additional pressure from labor groups on progressives in the House to withhold their vote for any number. Let's take Medicare for All off the table. Let's pretend that you think we're going to lose that vote by a margin that will ultimately hurt the movement. I don't personally agree with that, but let's just take that off the table. Let's say that we're doing this for getting rid of PAYGO, reaching a lot of ways and means, all these committee appointments that progressives ultimately didn't get, drafting some of these bills that are coming down the pike in committees with public hearings so that they're not just Nancy Pelosi specials. All of that are things that could have been asked for, but we never even got to have a conversation as a community about tailoring the ask to best meet the moment, because the argument was, because these unions aren't behind it, we're not going to pressure AOC and the rest of the squad members. I don't mean to put it on her in particular, but pressure the squad members of the progressives in Congress not to push for these asks. And so there was this way in that it felt like, because there wasn't more transparency, not that anybody's owed anything, but the lack of transparency bred a certain level of distrust that I think has now seeded the entire left. And I don't think that was necessarily needed to be the outcome. And we're not having a more sophisticated conversation at this point about what was obvious in 2020, which is that sometimes union leadership and rank and file have differences of opinion. Sometimes the interest of union leadership isn't necessarily the interest of the broader working class. Is there an extent to which the $15 minimum wage isn't something perhaps union leadership is as eager to push for because their members tend to already make more than that? Whereas, I don't know, the PRO Act obviously does and are more directly to their benefit. And I feel like we can't even have that conversation without it being like, you are against labor. You're the enemy.
See, now that's so interesting. First of all, because again, not because I'm happy to get into whatever it is, but like, because I was not even in that discussion, because we were literally trying to figure out how to keep the California schools closed in a pandemic, in a war with a bunch of Democrats in California, by the way, right? Like fighting a war with a Democratic governor, a Democratic legislature. I mean, California is like supermajority Democrats, and we were having a war, right? To try and like hold the line on like, can we not kill people in a pandemic? So but anyway, but if that, I didn't even know that was the rap. So if that, let's just say that was part of the rap. I wasn't in the discussion, but if that was part of the rap, even that's interesting. So here's what I would say, I think, or here's my initial thought, like to a girl who's like latecomer to the conversation. I would say this gets back to why we need to be teaching rank and file workers in very large numbers how to build power, because that power has to be exercised inside of their union. If their union leadership is engaged in a series of compromises that the rank and file are not feeling particularly good about. And I think you referenced Nevada. So you saw the difference between where people voted and what the official position was.
Right.
So it is actually very true. Like if you go back to 2012, I mean, in my second book, I outline the rebuild, the once mighty Chicago Teachers Union. Then I outline what a piece of crap the union became. And then I outline the rebuild and the takeover, right, by leftist forces and what they did to rebuild their power. That 2012 strike, rest in peace, Karen Lewis, or rest in power, I guess as I like to say, like that 2012 strike was not sanctioned. Like they didn't, like there was no like permission granted. Not that they had to get it, though most people like to try and, not do things that upset people. But like when they walked out at the time, 28,000 people strong and shut down Chicago in 2012, which is what kicked off a belief that ordinary working class folks could contend for power and win. They were also beginning to change the politics of their national union. Now, you might say it hasn't happened as fast as would be desired on a number of issues, but it actually, for me as an organizer, it's as important to see how that's changing the internal dynamics inside of a sub democracy called unions, as a metaphor for like the overall quote unquote, small d democracy that we have. So I do think what's so frustrating to me at the ripe age of 56 is I feel like, and it's why I keep doing the writing I'm doing, I feel like there's an entire generation that has grown up in the United States outside of understanding the difference between organizing and mobilizing, and that we have to do both. And I think right now we don't, and it doesn't mean we don't, it doesn't mean we don't force certain questions. I really don't mean that. Like, I don't want to get into something here. I'm just focused on I'm more focused on in the end game, what's going to take for us to win. And it's going to take a lot of workers getting strong inside a lot of unions and forcing different decisions inside of their unions. And it's going to take a lot of new workers forming new unions with a set of politics that's going to be more willing to challenge the establishment. Because that's my point about access versus power. I obviously don't think that I'm about to write about this because I was asked to write about it. Like I actually, what should unions be doing in this moment? Well, it's not worrying more about, are you getting cut off from the White House or not? It's just not, right? That's not the thing that we should be worried about.
That's what it felt like. And I'm not speaking for anyone, and I don't know that that's true. And I wish that somebody from these unions would come and talk to this. We've invited some of them. But what it felt like was wanting access, if not to the White House, but at least to the progressives who do share our interests broadly. And to say, I engaged in a debate about this with another host who alluded to the fact that someone from a congressperson's office had called them and asked them to back off this issue. And that there did seem to be an extent to which the congressional head was wagging the tail of the union leadership, as opposed to the other way around, which is how I think we would prefer that relationship to be. The union's heads also being reflective of rank and file's actual desire. And that's, again, where the distrust snuck in, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. But again, so for me, it's not making it so polarized, like not either or-ish, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm going to go back to the thing that the reason that my second book is called No Shortcuts is because I actually think there's a whole lot of stuff that we need to do right now to not have the planet blow up and more people have their someone putting their knee on their fucking neck and killing them, and excuse my language, and everything else. But we're not going to get there unless we build more power on the ground. Like we've never in history gotten to moments of really radical transformation without doing the hard work on the ground. And that's why I was saying it's super important for people. What I hear a lot of young folks say is, ugh, God, that takes forever. Bullshit. It does not take forever. That's why we were out there teaching thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people, here's the core fundamentals of power. I've had several national organizations, unnamed, call me for advice in the last, since Biden won. How could they win on some key issues that they're trying to win on? So we'll just leave out the topics for the moment. And to a phone call with mostly younger leaders, to a phone call to like 5 hours on a Saturday, can we borrow your sense of strategy? And at the end of every one of those phone calls, they say, well, can't we do it without all that organizing? And I say, oh, well, you tell me how. Mm-hmm. Who's going to go move Sinawah? Who's going to go move Manchin? Who's going to go move? We got these huge roadblocks standing in our way. And I literally have really smart people calling and saying, well, can't, what we're really good at is narrative change. We're really good at protests. We're really good at, like, can't we get around that power analysis, power building thing? And I'm like, man, if we can, I'm all for it. There is no historical context that I understand in this country where we have not had to dig in and do really effing hard work on the ground at a serious high capacity to then have enough power to then do the both end. Let's start calling the question on some big issues to test ourselves. But the way I was trained, we're not going to go for really big broke on something unless and until we think we've got a fair shot at it. Now, that's different than a vote. That's different than, like, do you want someone on the record? Because there are reasons. Obviously, people force the vote on the $15 an hour, right? The 15. Yeah.
So the thing with the PRO Act is, the question that I raised on the internet that caused me to get a lot of blowback was the way that PRO Act Manchin coming on board was framed was this is a big victory for the left. And I understand there's a lot of organizing that went into calling West Virginia. It also seems like the miners union also tied his hands to a certain degree. But my question was just to say, okay, shouldn't some of our organizing efforts, I shouldn't say our, because obviously I'm just a podcaster sitting in a room, but shouldn't some of the organizing efforts also be directed to the filibuster and some of the messaging efforts be about the filibuster so that Manchin doesn't get undue credit for backing a bill he knows is very unlikely to pass? Because that was the argument around force the vote as well. So just to say, let's broaden the conversation a little bit so that people aren't able to use the filibuster as cover to play as more progressive than they really are. Yeah.
Okay. Well, but even, and on that point, I mean, again, I'm not inside, like, I'm not invited to those things they call the tables anymore, right? Which I used to be, like the tables where deals are being cut all over the movement. There's the green table, there's the labor table there, right? There's all these tables. When I saw the, Joe Manchin, is going to co-sponsor, the PRO Act, I immediately thought, so that means Sinewah isn't, like, the calculation's been made, right? That's how power works.
Exactly.
Like, someone has made the calculation that he can do that because we've got 2 or 3 other boneheads.
Exactly.
I'm using a nice word, who are never going to flip, who are not going to flip, who he can do this. Look, this is basic power structure analysis stuff, right? Like, every time someone says, well, wow, look who's supporting X, Y, and Z, or even, look at what the House of Representatives under Nancy Pelosi passed when the Senate wasn't technically Democratic.
Exactly.
Majority. It's like, yeah, they passed that shit because they knew it wasn't going anywhere in the Senate, so they could get their track record, and then they were totally safe because the Senate was never going to do it. So so let's accept that we agree on that. Like, there is a game of power out there that is high level and serious. That's what I mean. I was in it enough to know, like, how that game is played, won a couple of major congressional fights in my life. I don't mean elections. I mean, like, getting $120 billion back into Medicare when George Bush killed it, right? Like, massive fights that took really intense power, 50-state strategy. How do we do it? How are we going to reverse $120 billion in cuts? That was 2003, by the way, the largest cut to Medicaid ever. Like, I have been in the rooms where I was in charge of the field, but it was like understanding the relationship between the field and how we were going to move power in Congress. So, but I think, here's one of the values of the podcast world. I don't think people understand how this shit works. And so I'd have to spend 3 hours talking to you and everyone else before the actual force the vote fight. And I'm not going to get into it because I wasn't in it.
Sure.
But what I will say is what you just said really matters. And a lot of people don't know it. Like, when you see the House pass something and the Republican Senate is the Republican Senate, it's because they all know they're safe doing it because they're big business. They go to their big business allies and say, oh, look, don't worry. If we could really pass it, I wouldn't vote for it. Right? That's the deal going down. So I don't know. Maybe Manchin did really move, and that's a great thing. But until someone shows me Manchin holding with the lunatic from Arizona and whoever the hell else is in the way, it's not going to be meaningful to me. But people don't understand that that's how some of the deals go down. What I will say, though, and I will stick to this, is we don't have the power right now to do much of what we need to do. And the way I'm focused on building the power to force the hand on much of what we need to force is about workers withdrawing their labor. The political system is one set of big-ass messes, and the labor movement is a different set, right? Both are important, but under capitalism and with the current Supreme Court, I mean, part of what's fascinating to me is like we keep forgetting about the new Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. Like we have this evil body that is sitting up there ready to just pounce on every damn good thing that's going to happen right now. So either way, like even if we snake some good laws through here, there, and whatnot, we got a Supreme Court that's going to call it whatever it is. They're just going to rule it a violation of the blah, blah, something,
clause, blah, blah,
blah, blah, right? So it brings us all the way back to the thing that I care the most about, which is that new generations of people in this country can better understand the power structure analysis and better understand that organizing, that deep organizing doesn't actually take a long time. It actually doesn't. And
that's urgent. Inspiring to me. Because I will say,
urgent.
There has been, part of the discourse was, and we had McAlevey on, and I really appreciate the time that he spent with us, but we were like, okay, screw the force the vote. What's the plan and the alternative? And there was this conversation about a 10, 20, 30-year effort to build power state by state. And it's not that I would never stand in the way of that effort, but coming off of a Bernie campaign where we're hearing all these stories of people in an immediate crisis, that starts to feel demoralizing. But so you saying that the organizing can happen at a faster pace than that, that's what Mama loves to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, look, the truth is it can happen faster, and it does happen faster. And part of why, part of why I wrote all three of the books that I've written is to show what works. I'm actually not interested, in that little article I wrote recently. I'm actually not interested in analyzing failure very much because I'm not interested in failure. I'm interested in analyzing success. All three of my books are case study after case study after case study of how you do it and how it works. And since the whole last book is about huge victories that happened after he who shall never be named again took office, it implies that, in the West Virginia strike, that was about 7 months of building. Okay? So you can do the work. I mean, it's not to say we shouldn't have a 20 and 30 year and 40 year plan. We should, although with the climate crisis, those numbers like shit. Can we just have a 5-year plan? You know what I mean? And I actually think we can. Like, I think that we can have a 20, again, if 1933, 1934, what set the context for the passage of not just the National Relations Act, but a whole bevy of the most progressive legislation that passed in this country was not because Francis Perkins and FDR got together and had a little chat. It's because a bunch of militant unions started doing massive illegal strikes all over the United States of America, got their heads beat in, went to jail. It was, it took a lot of action and a lot of risk. And it took a lot of costing the employers a lot of money. Before the condition. And we saw that with the civil rights movement too, right? What's different is we have all those tapes and the dialogue that happened right between King and all the famous tapes now and blah, blah, blah. But there is an inside out interaction. It's that right now the forces on the outside on our side are just effing too weak. We are just weak and we can do it fast. And every single story I write about in every case study, the Chicago Teachers Union, I mean, they went from, a union that I don't think anyone in this set of squares or most anyone I know would think was worth anything. And then a bunch of progressives decided, oh my God, our union's terrible. Let's figure out how to take it over and turn it into a force of good. And within 2 years, they did that. And within the next year, they reset the entire discussion in the United States of America about the power of the strike, right? That's not a long time. But they had a method, they had a strategy, they had discipline.
So this conversation is taking place in the shadow of Bessemer, right? And, I read your postmortem in The Nation. I thought it was very good. It's very smart. I think everyone should read it. One of the things you mentioned is the what you term the labor media kind of overhyping this union vote, which if you were reading Twitter, if you were, listening to lefties talk about this vote, you would not have come off with the impression that it would have been a blowout for management. And so, I hope this is a good, kind of closer here.
It doesn't sound like it so far, but go for it.
Okay, no, I'm cultivating a little narrative here, so this is going to be roller coaster swings.
Yes.
A lot of our listeners are members of unions that they are trying to radicalize. They are trying to start organized unions. They don't know where to start, so on. Or they just simply want to show solidarity with unions and union organizing efforts. So what lessons, and I know you go over this in the article, but what lessons would you want our audience to take away from Bessemer? And also, why should they not be despairing about what we all agree is just a central political project right now, which is clawing back worker power from the Amazon economy?
Yeah. Oh my God. Okay, good. Thanks for bobbing and weaving to the punchline that lets me get to go. Yeah. Okay.
Few surprises there, huh?
No, yeah, that was good. I like that. I like the weave in there. I've just been notably getting attacked for suggesting that the campaign was overhyped, by the way. So, which I think is hilarious. Like everywhere I go, people are like, general audience. I was doing a big speech for Canadian negotiators 2 days ago for all the whatever. So, and they were like, literally the first question from the audience was, God, from up here, just from reading the media, like we all just expected them to win. I was like, oh, hello. Anyway, so I would say, one, oh my God, all is not lost. First of all, two, there's a lot of, there's this Amazonian network. There's, Democratic Socialists are creating an essential worker thing that's connected to the United Electoral Workers. There's a separate thing called the Amazonians. There's a third thing called by the way, I'm working with workers all over Europe who are going after Amazon, right? This is not a one-headed monster. So it also needs to be an international strategy. Like part of why I'm having so much fun leading a team now of doing these international trainings with workers all over the damn world is because we ain't taking down one of these mofos even just in our domestic little territory. Yeah. So part of the question is like, where can we take them down first and best, right? That's one thing. Like, what's the strategic power analysis of where to take down a multi-headed hydra? So I think not only do I am not depressed at all. I'm only depressed when I see bad strategy being executed, right? To me, that depresses me, but not the fact that workers are going to be at Amazon, Uber, Lyft, and fill in the blank of these absolutely, I call them medieval in the article, right? Like Silicon Valley is like literally recreating literally medieval standards. So I have so much undying faith in people when you teach workers what I call how to build a credible plan to win. Like the concept of a credible plan to win, those are words that I use when I'm teaching. Like workers, if they are part of making the strategy and are deeply bought into what is a credible plan to win, it starts by educating them about how hard the fight is going to be. No bullshitting about that up front. And then it moves to a series of steps that connect the issues they care about to what the path to victory is. And then you can articulate how other workers have done this themselves and won. And then you're creating mini campaigns in something like an Amazon or fill in the blank campaign. You're creating mini campaigns along the way that allow the workers to gain confidence, because what the working class in this country ain't got, because it's beat out of them in the media and by the employer class every day, is confidence in themselves, right? The number one job of an organizer is helping individuals and then collective bunch of people have confidence in their capacity to actually do that which they need to do to beat the crap out of their employers and take some justice back in this country. And they can do it. And I can only say that because I've had the pleasure of doing it for 30 effing years, and they just keep doing it. So we are going to take the country back. And the question is, can we do it fast enough before the planet burns down? Our sense of urgency is like, for me, I always say a key quality of an organizer is like, you have to know how to create a sense of urgency. Like, why do you have to do this X and Y and Z now? I just think the sense of urgency, the whole time frame is radically shifted since I got locked indoors in a pandemic because of the fire season in California last fall. You couldn't go out. I mean, you couldn't go out somewhere social. You couldn't go indoors with people because of the pandemic. And then suddenly you couldn't go outdoors for 2 months because you couldn't effing breathe and the whole place is burning down. Like we have a sense of urgency. We can make a 2, 3, and 4 year, we can make a 2-year plan to take certain states, right? So I appreciate we need a long view, like the right always has the long game and the long view, but we can have we can have a way bigger impact way sooner if we put our minds to it. And there are a bunch of smart people trying to do that right now all over. And they're not out in public. And I'm not out in public with half the work I'm doing because that's why I'm not on, because it wouldn't be helpful, right, to the actual work. So we can do it. Workers can do it. We can be at Amazon. I really believe it. And I think that we will.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the time. You've been so generous. And please do come back, because there were like 15 things that came up that we could devote an hour to each.
Yeah.
And more people need to hear from you and get these granular historical lessons and contemporary lessons as well. So I won't keep you.
Total pleasure.
Really
Thank
quickly,
you so much. Yeah.
Before you go, Jane, where can people sign up at the Rosa Luxemburg School, and where can people pirate your books?
Yeah, anywhere you want. Frankly, just buy one and photocopy them. Okay, don't tell my publishers that. But I don't actually know, but grad students always seem to know how to do those things. So, but people can sign up. They can go to my website. That's one way. They can just Google Organizing for Power, because that's what the series is called. This one's called Workers Rising Everywhere. We have a huge international training team. Oh my God, it's so exciting. I was just doing train the trainer work this morning with our team. We have South African trade unions. This is like a global training team from all. The course is taught in 7 languages simultaneously on Zoom. It is wild. People have to come in groups. So the cutoff is the 3rd of May, which is coming right up for this course. But it is literally free. So if people go to my website or Google Organizing for Power, I recommend it because it's free and because you can do it, and you're going to get some foundational skills to learn how to win.
Okay, we'll have links in the description of this episode.
Awesome.
Jane McAlevey, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for the work you're doing.